I've been trying to think of a specific teacher who was kind of a mentor, and I don't have that kind of relationships in my past. But I do have a relationship with a poet who was in many ways a godfather for my poems. He was a professor at the University of Pennsylvania, where I was a student in graduate school for one disastrous year, 1968-70. His name was Daniel Hoffman. He taught poetry, the study of poetry, not creative writing, but poetry as literature at Penn, and I was in his class, and toward the end of the semester, I must have showed him some of my poems during his office hours. In any case, he invited me to submit some poems to an anthology he was editing of poems by poets who had some connection with the University of Pennsylvania. And he put one of my poems in this anthology, so I'm there along with, let me see, the one other person I remember was Ezra Pound. And I dropped out of graduate school at the end of the year and stopped writing poetry for about 10 years. And when I started writing again, after 10 years, I finished a poem I had been working on when I was at PEN, and that I had showed to Dan when I was a student there. And I finished it. It had been unfinished for 10 years. And when I finished it, I put it in an envelope and sent it to him with a note saying, "You probably don't remember this, but your suggestions helped me 10 years ago, and I thought you might be interested in seeing where I've taken this poem." And he wrote back right away and encouraged me to send him more poems, which I did. And he conducted, I suppose, a kind of correspondence course with me for about a year. I would send him poems, he would make some suggestions and encourage me, and I would send him revisions. And after about a year, he said he knew now that if he came across one of my poems in a journal, even not knowing who had written it, he would know it was by me, because I had found my voice, and that he thought I was ready to have a book, and told me to put together a manuscript and send it to him, and he would send it out for me. This was Daniel Hoffman, who in his younger years was a Yale Younger Poet. He was one of the, before they started calling the office the Poet Laureate of the United States, it was a consultant in poetry for the Library of Congress. Dan had done that for 1 or 2 years. So it was he who arranged for my book to be published. When it was published, it was Dan who arranged for me to have my first big poetry reading at the University of Pennsylvania. It was Dan who introduced me to that reading. It was Dan who blurbed my first, I think, 2 books. And I would say also that he did this for several other young poets. And I have always felt I owed him my life in a lot of ways. So that's Daniel Hoffman, who should be read. People forget about poets who were important. As soon as we die, we're forgotten. Dan has work that should be read.